Hello, everyone. This is Jeffrey Geisner for the Obligations of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group. And I'm pleased to have back with us Yifat Cohn-Meir from Israel. And our last episode, we talked about many things. Her father was a survivor, both from Auschwitz and from Buchenwald. He's the author of The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz, which is an incredible set of drawings that were made, over 80 drawings, if I remember, speaking about and visualizing what took place in the camps. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, more so about his art and what happened to him to be able to express himself. We'll also talk about intergenerational trauma and how that has affected Yifat and her siblings, as well as her children. And we're going to have lots to talk about. So we'll get started with the question about your father's, after he was liberated, and maybe you can give us all a sense of what took place. And we'll start there. Welcome, Yifat.
Hi, thank you so much, Jeffrey, for this very unique and special project that you have. And thank you for having me again. So we thought to talk a little bit about the art part of the memory and my father's special life project as an artist, and also the way it affected us. So as you mentioned, my father was, he is an Holocaust survivor, and he was first in Auschwitz for 19 months, and then he was moved to Buchenwald and liberated from Buchenwald in April 1945.
And I just want to say that your father is still living.
Yes.
He's living with you nearby in Israel. How old is your father now?
Oh, he's 92.
Terrific. Okay.
So when he was in the camp, he was very well this time of the night in Israel now. So he's not participating, but he's well, and he still gives testimonies from time to time, and very clear about, he remembers the past very clearly. And I think part of that was that he recorded his memories very early on. First thing was those drawings we're going to talk about now, and just a few years later also he wrote the things, his testimony as well, and published it very early in the 50s. So The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz is a new version of his memoirs, and they were published very early. So the memory is very strong in his mind, and he's still active witness up to this day. He was very young when he was exceptionally young in the camps. He was captured at 13, and he was liberated at 15. And the camps usually, most of the times, children under 15 were sent to death at arrival. The camps were meant to have working manpower and women and men to work, and usually they were 15 and above. He was very tall and strong, so they thought he was older, and by the time they figure out he's younger, they left him be, and that saved his life. The way he was strong and tall, and he survived those almost 2 years, 22 months in camps, in the concentration camps, as a teenager, very young teenager. And that's part of what makes his testimony unique. And at liberation, it took a while until, they opened the gate. It was April 45. The Americans arrived into Buchenwald, found 10,000, about 50,000 or so people survived there. And they were very weak, and it took a long time to decide what to do with survivors and to help them recover first, and then decide what to do with them. My father was a teenager, and there were about 900 teenagers survived Buchenwald. And one of the projects for the teenagers were the Swiss government invited about 400 teenagers to come to Switzerland to recover. But before that, that happened in June. So from April to June, for 2 months, my father was still in Buchenwald, very weak, very ill and weak, could hardly walk. And he was he was moved to a block with other German speaking. He is from Germany originally. So he was placed with other grown-ups who speaks German. They split them into nations and languages after the liberation. So luckily in his block was other political prisoners from Germany and Austria. One of them was Eugen, who was a historian, and they got a mission from the American army to collect information that left behind information in the camps, in the headquarters and in the dorms of the officers. So they all day long, they went around to collect information, maps and lists and notes and everything. And they placed all that in the block. And my father was too weak to walk around, so he was sitting next to the table looking at those papers and learning. He was very curious and he learned all that information. But he also had his memoirs of almost 2 years in his own events and what he saw around him. He was a very curious young guy, and he had amazing memory for details and attention to details. And he wanted to believe that his father and his mother are still alive. And he felt the urge to express what happened to him, to tell them about it. And his way of doing it, his first idea was just to draw what happened. So he asked his friends, and they found in the headquarters some little notes, like postcards from the officers, and one side of them were blank. So they brought him those postcards, and the tips of pencils first were just plain pencils, and later he got some colored pencils, and later on even some watercolors. And he started to draw tiny miniature, very expressive and full of details, little drawings on each of those postcards. Eventually there were over 80 of those drawings, expressing not just the events he went through and the scenes of life. He really wanted to expose the life in the camps.
And I want to tell the audience that Yifat gave a tremendous presentation for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group about the book, The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz. And many of those photographs are available to be seen on that program. So you should go to the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance YouTube channel to be able to see that. There's also a book that is available on Amazon. Am I correct? It's yes. Correct, on Amazon. And you have a website that you can share so people who are listening can obviously go to the website. What is that?
Yeah, it's thomasgeves.com.
Okay.
And the website is being renewed soon. So on the new website, you could see all of those drawings. But that will be very soon. But also now the existing website has most of them.
The last program, I found something out. Thomas Cohen is really the name of your father, right? So maybe you can give us the reasoning why Thomas Geves is used and not Thomas Cohen.
Well, he's not into exposing his real name at all. It's not the full name. He has a full name. He went on living with his real name, but when he was 16, arriving to England, he wanted to leave the past behind because he didn't want, the survivors those days were not always respected in a way they wanted to be. I mean, sometimes there were people who were suspicious about them. Sometimes people thought they probably went crazy, and many other reasons. And of course, they have their fears of being maybe found by people who still want to eliminate them. And, there are many reasons why people wanted to keep on hiding their real identities. Many Holocaust survivors changed their names.
And I don't know if I mentioned to you, my father's younger brother, Horst Geisner, went with his mother, got out in 1939 from Berlin, Germany, to Manchester. And he immediately changed his name from Horst Geisner to Harry Gilbert, to make your point. And even he was interned in Australia at age 15 because the British government thought there would be spies among the Germans who were coming into the country through these transfer passes. So I know exactly what, from my history, what you're speaking about.
Yes, so many survivors left the real name, the born name behind. They left the past behind and chose new names, many times also to feel more comfortable with the new countries. Most of them moved around to America, to Israel, other countries, and they wanted the local names to be like, all the others and start a new future. But my father's decision was very interesting because he decided he wanted to keep his real name. And he gave himself a pseudonym once they started to interview him in England. And once he decided to publish his story, to write his story. And
how old was he? How old was he at that point?
At the point he gave himself the pseudonym he was 16 or about 16, 17. A first journalist started to get to know him and ask him questions and saw his drawings first. And he felt like he needs to go on forward with his life.
So where did he learn English?
He went to, after recovery in Switzerland, he was united with his father. His father survived. He was in England. And they were reunited in England. And he was there just for a few years. He was 20 when he left. So he was there for about 4 years. And then he decided to move on to Israel. Israel was a new country then established, and he went on to the Jewish land. So on those years in England, he was very talented to languages. Also in the camp, he learned quite a few languages, and that also helped him to get connected with people and gain information.
Was his father happy that he went to Israel?
Not at all. Although he was a Zionist himself, and when he was back in Germany before the war, he was helping he was helping the Zionist Jews to go to Israel, and he was checking them without taking any fee. He was really a Zionist, but after the war, with all the trauma of the war, and he also remarried in England, and he had a baby daughter. So he was established in England. And my father felt the urge to move on and to get to the Jewish land. And his father didn't like that at all.
What was the pull that your father told you that pushed him to go to Israel from England? It was something, to leave a family for the second time is difficult.
That was a hard decision, but he felt that that's his home. He would never feel at home unless he's in a Jewish state. And it was a tough decision, but he decided he had to do it. And also he had some friends in Israel that immigrated to Israel from Germany and from Switzerland. And they told him, we need you here, and we need every man to help. And with all that history, he felt the urge, and he has to take part of that. And it's a whole issue, a whole story about what happened to him when he arrived to Israel, and how everything that happened to him during the Holocaust affect his decision later on, also in Israel. Everything built up to what he did in Israel.
So what year did he leave from England to Israel?
The year of 50. So Israel was just 2 years old, and he was 20 when he left England and established in Israel.
My father got out of Nazi Berlin at 15 on the last Hadassah Aliyot transfer. He grew up on Kibbutz Yagur. He fought in the War of Independence in the Air Force. He made propellers for the planes in the Haganah Air Force. And he met my mom in 1948 in Tel Aviv on a beach, and they were married in Tel Aviv in 1950. They came to the United States in 1954. So my father and mother decided to leave Israel. And it's interesting because they never wanted my sister and I to ever go to Israel for the fear that we would do an aliyah and stay in Israel. So from a little child, I was told you cannot go to Israel.
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Yeah. But I guess there's reasons why they felt they have to leave. But that was hard, very, very hard times in Israel those times. So many people felt they should leave, but he had the urge to come over. And he was fearless after all he went through. Would you like me to go back to the arts, or you want to go?
No, continue.
Yeah, okay. So I just mentioned before that he decided to express the events of those last 2 years in camps through drawings. But there were not just drawings, there were all sorts of lists and maps and sketches. And his idea was to squeeze as much as possible information into those cards. And so now we have an amazing testimony. He's leaving us with lots of information about how life looked like in the camps. Of course, only people who were there can tell us that. And it was checked, later on by historians, and the facts are very accurate. He was very insisting on having everything accurate, and he was also comparing information to that historical documents his friends found as well. So some of those documents are actually copied from those lists as well. And he was talking to people, and he was checking his facts as much as he could.
So did your father have the reason why he wanted to put down this drawing? Was there a reason that he didn't for future deniers? What was his motivation that he really wanted to leave this legacy of story, what happened to him?
Well, I think the motivation and the urge to do that was quite a few different things. One was to express what happened and to tell try to tell his parents later on. So he wanted to put everything on paper so he won't forget. So he was also always, since he was a very young child, he was always obsessed with technical issues and with details of life. He was very curious, and he loved those things, those details. So that was part of his personality as well. But he really wanted to put as much as he can, as much information as he can. He also felt it's important that someone have to collect all this information. You have like an inner feeling, it's important to document everything. He also was, as I said, in the same block of those historians. So I'm sure he was also affected by their urge, all the people who were, many of them were political prisoners. So they had their history of being politically involved. So I'm sure they had their own agenda to document everything, and that affected him as well. And he documented things in his way. He could not write things. He was too weak, and he also hardly went to school as a boy. In those days, he was from Germany, so school was over for him when he was about 10 or so. He was mainly in the streets, and he was living in Berlin for a few years before he was captured. So he didn't go much to school. So the written language was not too much of his tools, more like the drawings. And very interestingly, he drew a little bit in Auschwitz on scratched of paper he found, but he didn't draw much before, and he never drew after. These 18 drawings was his life arts, his life work, and he didn't do although he became, later on, he became a building engineer and an architect. So he did some arts and his work, but officially that he always said, I drew once and that's it. But those drawings carry so much. And
so how did the drawings affect you?
Well, it tells the whole story. It tells so much. And also nowadays, when I became involved only up to 10 years ago, my father did not mix his personal life with his past. So everything to do with his testimony was a separate life. He went to Europe. He didn't do much in Israel, mainly in Europe. Everyone knew him there by his name, Thomas Geves. And in Israel, people did not express his history in Israel, not in the family.
So how many, I know that you have one brother, but he passed, right? So when did you realize that your father was in Auschwitz? At what age?
Oh, very young. We knew that because he has, first of all, he has a number on, it's a tattoo on his arm. You can't, ignore that. We knew, everyone knew that. We knew he's a Holocaust survivor. We didn't know the details of the story.
But he didn't tell you his story.
No.
And
he didn't share the stories. My mother told us a few things, details that were relevant, but not much.
Very similar.
We knew there's a book. We
Yeah.
knew that the book, but when we were young, the book was just in English. We couldn't read it.
Mhm.
I was 20 when I could first read it. So,
Okay, so
and the first book did not carry the drawings. So
let's take a look at when you were
the
20.
drawings were published first in 1997.
All right, so when you were 20,
So,
and you read the book without drawings, how did
right.
it impact your life?
It just connected, it's like connecting the dots of things I knew already, but having more information through them, of course. But the effect was, if you want to talk about that, the effect was everywhere all the time, and not just our personal being, second generation, being an Israeli, living in Israel, it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's in your school, it's in the politics. We have the Memorial Day and we are connected with the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors. We're surrounded with that. It's part of our life in many ways, a part of our culture. So it's not just the personal connection, it was also the national connection. I knew more stories of others than my own father, because we learn about that from very early age in Israel.
That's very interesting. So what was the process that your father took to get from the written publishing to the art publishing? Was there?
Well, it was the other way around. And actually, we thought that when we were talking about, today, to emphasize the part of arts in the whole story of surviving and documenting the Holocaust and education. And so his first ambition was to document what happened mainly to his parents, but also probably to others. But the first motivation was that. And then he went to Switzerland, as I mentioned. His only possession was the rags he was wearing from Buchenwald and this pile of postcards. That's the only thing he had when he arrived to Switzerland. Now, when he entered Switzerland, they had to go through quarantine. And he and some other boys, on the way, on all the traveling, and it took a long time to get to Switzerland, they had some kind of skin lice or disease. So when they went to quarantine, my father and some other boys, they had to go through a process of disinfection, and they made some mistake there. Anyway, he got irritation in his skin. Something happened through this process, and he was affected, and he was wounded. His whole body was, his skin was very much infected by this thing, and he was hospitalized for a few weeks. He couldn't move. He was in a very bad condition, and he couldn't move. And he stuck those piles of drawings under his pillow. That was his only thing he had. He was barely naked, and that's the only thing he had in his life: his own body, his memories, and his drawings. And lying there very poorly in the hospital for those few weeks, he had an amazing young guy, Rudy, and he took care of him, and they got friendly. And when my father was a bit recovered, he brought him books and talked to him, and they got friendly. And my father, as a gratitude to his new friend, he showed him his drawings. And when his friend saw those drawings, he felt like that's a very important thing. And he asked for permission to share those drawings with the other teachers. They were sent to a boarding school later on in Zuckerberg. And yeah, so he shared those drawings with the other teachers. And they were, of course, amazed and touched by those drawings. But the amazing effect was that they thought, wow, this is a great idea. And later on, they encouraged the other boys. There were about 100 boys arriving to Zuckerberg, where my father was later sent to. And they encouraged all the other boys to draw their experiences as well. So those days, people were not that aware of the effect of arts and the art therapy. It was not developed yet. But, my father's urge to put things in arts, through arts, affected the ability of other boys to express themselves that way too. And of course, in Switzerland, they have more ability. They got them, real papers and colors and everything. So that drove other boys to make amazing others drawings. Now, some of them copied my father's drawings, sometimes exactly the same style and everything. And sometimes some of them changed. They took the idea, the memory of the scene, but they did it in their own style. And some of them added other scenes they experienced. So nowadays, it's very interesting. There were actually the book, The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz, was born through connection with another amazing guy, Charlie Ingerfield, who lived in Zuckerberg a few years ago. And he happened to find a brochure about an exhibition that boarding school Zuckerberg did about those boys from Buchenwald. It was a few years ago, and he found the brochure and he was curious about it, and he found my father's name and he connected us. And that's how it was actually his motivation to bring out this testimony out again last year and this year again. So that's another power of those drawings. Charlie found us through those drawings. But in that exhibition in Zuckerberg, they show also the other boys' works. And you can see the effect and the connection of those drawings between the boys. And how, there was another boy, for instance, who had more talent of drawing. And also he had big papers and he had the time and the energy. And he made some of those scenes are more details in his drawings. So it's like, it's connected. It's like affecting, like a butterfly effect. One is doing one thing and how it affects the others. It's amazing.
Is that exhibition available digitally?
I don't know. We could check that with Zuckerberg School nowadays.
That would be very interesting for you and I to explore that, because I think that exhibit and bringing it to the world in the way we can, I think would be really interesting. So, well,
the drawings were exposed afterwards as well in other ways. But another interesting thing happened, that one of the teachers on that boarding school was a young lady. She volunteered. She was quite young then, Lisolette Waltz. With years, she was an artist herself, and with years, she also went into the idea of art therapy, which is amazing, another effect, it probably affected her life. And she was really amazed by my father's work, and she asked his permission. And she wrote a diary, which nowadays is displayed in Yad Vashem. It was donated to Yad Vashem. And she copied all of his drawings into her diary, which is amazing. And it's amazing in a few meanings. And one of them is that some of my father's drawings were lost, either taken or lost, or he lost some of them. And many years later, when they got this journal, her diary in Yad Vashem, we found quite a few more, but one of them that was missing was amazing, because that's the only one who Thomas, he drew his own personal details. He drew his number on this drawing. Now, I talked to him about this just a couple of weeks ago, how interesting it is that drawing was missing, because why would it interest the others? So he told me something I didn't know before. He said, no, it was not lost. I took it out. I did not pass it forward to Yad Vashem. I kept it because I didn't want to put my personal details. My father, all the way through, he felt that he's holding a testimony that holds a story of the millions of people around him. And he's like a journalist to express everyone's life. And he did not want to be the center of the story. He did not want the spotlight on him. And that's why he's still on insisting to go by his pseudonym and not his real name, because he doesn't want the spotlights. He said, I'm expressing everyone's story, not just my own personal.
Well, I want to let you know, Yifat, that we've come to the 30-minute of our episodes, and we're going to take a break here. We'll come back with more with Yifat Cohn-Meir, coming from Israel, talking about the book The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz, Thomas Geves, and more about her story. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much.
And we'll see you on the other side.